Welcome to the Curious Curate. I'm so excited for our guest today, Jonathan McKenzie. Jonathan is youth director at Christ Church Presbyterian in Augusta, Georgia, and has done work with Davenant and is active on Twitter. And you probably have heard of him and know about him. Jonathan is kind of our Anglicans' honorary Presbyterian friend, and I think we have the same relationship in return. It was awesome to hang out with you at Anglican Way and see you in person, and just really appreciate kind of the way that things that you're talking about on Twitter, and just excited to have you on. And so today we're going to talk about a little bit about your journey, about from being entertaining Anglicanism to returning to Presbyterianism, some of the stuff that you're doing with Davenant, and so I'm just really excited to have you on. Thank you, Jonathan, for coming on.
Dude, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be counted as a worthy amongst the other guests, like Bishop Peter Robinson and Richard Tarsitano and my favorite Anglicans you've had on. So you just got to get Wedgeworth on, and then you've completed my trio of favorite living Anglicans. So
Mount Rushmore of current Anglicans. Well, we do have an episode with him coming out later, so
great, beautiful.
Stay tuned on that. Yeah, is there a regulative principle in Anglicanism? That was the kind of the question.
Oh, that would be a good episode. Yeah,
the fun stuff
yes.
that people don't know,
yes.
or even the conversations to be had.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so thanks for coming on. I thought for people who might know you as the one of the Presbyterian on Twitter. Just wanted to talk to you and ask you about kind of like your journey from exploring Anglicanism at one point and then returning to Presbyterianism. I know that there's a lot of young people who encounter these different traditions online, and I think sometimes it's just kind of helpful to hear how someone approached it, what their journey was like, what their story was like. So you're considering Anglicanism obviously at one point. That's how we kind of connected.
Right.
And I'm just curious, kind of like, what was that journey like? What brought you into Anglicanism? What made you curious about it? And what kind of ultimately brought you returning to Presbyterianism?
Yeah. I'll try to keep it somewhat brief, but I grew up in kind of the Southern Baptist world, Calvinistic side of that. Dad's a SBC pastor. But in high school, I kind of read my way into Reformed, Paedo-Baptist Reformed theology. And by the end of high school, I was reading one of these like guys called the Federal Vision guys. We all probably heard of these guys like Lightheart and Jordan. Not a lot of Wilson, but here and there Wilson. And so Paedo communion became like half my personality, even though I had no kids and was years away from having kids. And so at that point, I knew I wanted to be going to ministry someday. And so I thought, well, I either have to join the CREC. Or join Anglicanism, because I knew you could be a Calvinist Anglican and do Paedo communion. So that was like my initial interest in Anglicanism. But then senior year of high school, I got my hands on a 1662 prayer book and started doing the daily office. I kind of immediately fell in love with kind of the worship in the Anglican way, at least the text of that worship. And so when I went to do my undergrad in Orlando, I initially was really hoping to join an Anglican church. That was my goal. But just found out there just wasn't really any like ACNA churches near me in Orlando at the time. There was one kind of like independent Reformed-ish Sydney Anglican sort of a parish, but they have changed their affiliation like 5 times in the last 6 years. So there just wasn't a stable place. So I joined a small Presbyterian church that was Anglican-ish and Paedo communion ish. But then so really my entire time during my undergrad, my plan was always to like ditch Presbyterianism the first chance I got. Because as I continued to read, I got into actually reading like 17th century Anglicans like John Davenant and 16th century guys like Hooker, and started to fall in love with kind of that classic pre-Laudian sort of Anglicanism. And so that's where I wanted to go. So long story short, I had a short stint in the Episcopal Diocese in Central Florida as a youth director at a cathedral there. But I just realized that wasn't going to work out. And so I landed myself at a PCA church. Stopped being Paedo communion at some point as I got more into Anglicanism in the Anglican way. And then, so I'm trying to figure out how to tell the story properly. But Essentially, yeah, I mean, I kind of become convinced of Hooker's approach to, I think, ecclesiastical polity of worship, the right of the church to introduce not new elements of worship, but ceremony and around the elements, the right of the church to organize its government as it found prudent, but taking in mind that there are certain things that were jure divina, like the office of the ministry, and so I started to be really attracted kind of to that pristine form of the tradition, late 17th century. Visited a few places, hoping to move after my undergrad to kind of start that journey. Began attending the Anglican Way Conference in Savannah, which you should all go to if you're an Anglican. It's a really good time. Started listening and reading guys like Wedgworth and Trisitano and that sort of world. So that's what got me kind of initially in that world. I was just a true believer in early English Reformed divinity, you could say. But that's what got me into that world, yeah. And so I was thinking about, maybe the REC or Diocese Living Word, kind of like my two, where my eyes were on.
Yeah. Well, I think that's, it's like a helpful kind of, just journey of an intellectual journey, kind of starting, I feel like for everyone who grew up kind of Baptist, it starts with like somehow the Federal Vision and the CREC kind of world kind of sparks some kind of like interest that puts different people in down different rabbit trails and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And so when you were kind of in that, obviously you felt a call to ministry. So when you're discerning a tradition to join, it's a little bit more weighty, a little bit more, you're considering factors beyond maybe like a local parish, or if someone's like,
right,
I like the Book of Common Prayer and I have a great Anglican parish, like this is where I'm going to be. Whereas when you're discerning ministry, there's a lot more factors. So when you were kind of like looking at Anglicanism and what did you imagine kind of like that church? What did you imagine that vocational path potentially looking like, and how did you weigh like your theological convictions that you had about Anglicanism, more like this Reformed conformist kind of vision versus what you saw, and how did that maybe play a factor for you, or did it not? What did it look like? Like Anglicanism that I like, that because this is something that I think people experience. Like there's a version or an expression of Anglicanism that I've read into that I really enjoy. And then I look at kind of like the actual lay of the land, and maybe there's a little bit of a disconnect. What factor did that kind of play for you?
Answer your question. Yeah. Well, I realized once I started becoming serious about not just Anglicanism as like the ACNA posters you see on the website about, like millions around the world and we're majority African, kind of like those things that kind of feel like evangelicals to pull them in, which like are like true things, but I don't think they really matter much in the life of like the average church attending person, other than in the imagination they get to cast themselves as part of the global South movement, which I don't want to pull away from the great things that come from that. Sure. But once I kind of came to Anglicanism in the tradition, I kind of realized that like, man, it's kind of slim pickings if you're a Reformed kind of conformist guy and you don't want to you want to be in a place where you're not going to have female priests or even deacons, and so I kind of knew like the REC or the Diocese Living Word would probably have been like a great place for me at the time. So like my plan was really just like once I got out of Orlando to go move somewhere where I could join either like a good REC diocese or the Diocese Living Word, and even there, I started to realize, look, in the REC, actually, if you're a Reformed conformist, you're a minority in that world. And so I was like, okay, I guess it's like ADLW or bust, or something like that, and so I think I was, at the time, like the state of modern Anglicanism didn't bother me, because at the end of the day, I was like, well, I know the true perfect form of religion is 17th century, Anglicanism. And I'm just going to instantiate what I think is the pure form of religion in the world, right? So it's okay that only like 5 churches at the time use the 1662 IE, right? Because I'll be one of them, and we will, instantiate the true form of religion and recover it. And I mean, there's people that are doing that, and I think they're doing a good job of it. And I think they're doing it because they truly believe it and they grew up in the tradition, and that makes a lot of sense. But that was kind of my idea. I'm going to come in, and wage the war for the Reformed conformist religion. So that was my initial approach. But the more I guess kind of like talk about why I didn't end up doing that if you're kicked out. Yeah.
Yeah.
The
So
more kind
what?
of
So you kind of come
yeah.
to that realization, like,
Okay.
okay, with based on my expression or based on how I,
Mhm.
what I see to be, Anglicanism at its best, there's not really happening. And you realize,
Mhm.
like, okay, I could just like, be one of the 5 people planting my 1662 IE
Right.
flag and kind of just like bunkering down. You kind of
Yeah.
come to terms with that reality. And then maybe what was the shift where you're like, maybe that's not the way that I want to go?
Yeah. So when I moved out to South Carolina to work for Davenant as kind of their intern gopher groundsman on the property, it was great. Got away from the kind of the world I'd been in the last 4 years and got out into the woods, just kind of clear my head and walk around South Carolina. It was really through conversations I had with some of the Davenant guys, like Joe Minnick and Colin Redimer. And kind of, I think the Davenant's approach to kind of like wisdom of a worldview, where the way I was kind of approaching the question was, I was trying to compare what I thought were like the most pure forms of the Presbyterian religion and Anglicanism. And so I was like, true Scottish Covenanter. I know I'm not that. I
Uh,
know I know I could be really, really happy in like the Reformed conformist crowd of Anglicanism. But that just like isn't what modern Anglicanism is. And it's not what modern Presbyterianism is. And I kind of learned that you can't think about these questions in terms of like their pure Platonic forms, because you have to deal with like the world as it is and as it's given to you,
sure.
which is kind of a shift for me and kind of the way I kind of view the world in general. Is just you got to deal with like the world in front of you,
Mhm.
um, and and the world in front of me is a very different story, right? Like American Presbyterianism as it develops is very different than Scottish Presbyterianism historically was. And the same is true, I think, for like modern Anglicanism. It's a different animal than even like the years of Lottie and ascendancy, right? When they take everything back after 1662 and really run the show as the old high church crowd. Like that crowd, I get along a lot better with those guys probably even than with the Covenanters. Um, and so that kind of shifted the way I viewed it.
Yeah.
And I began just thinking about, okay, then what is it that actually draws me to leave my membership of the PCA for Anglicanism? Because in the day, like I wasn't at the time like a jure divino episcopacy guy. I
Right.
like the form of episcopacy. I specifically like the American episcopacy and the Protestant Episcopal Church approach,
Yeah.
with the way they the diocesan synods and it's Presbyterial-ish,
Sure.
um, and and so it's like, well, I don't need to join for polity reasons.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, well, doctrinally, it's like, well, I could sign off on a Westminster Confession. Um, and then I was like, well, then it really comes down to like the prayer book, which I love the prayer book, loved it, still love it. I really think it's been a useful form of piety that's lasted, to stood the test of time. But then I was like, well, realistically, like, there are like a handful of ACNA churches that doctrinally I'm aligned with that use a classic prayer book. And so it's just like, it's not a lot, And is that a sufficient reason for me to leave where I'm at? And looking at the PCA, I was like, well, man, we celebrate holidays now. We're kind of free to do these liturgical things now. Yeah, there's not that broad scale conformity, which is a problem in the PCA. But at the end of the day, when it comes down to the three marks, it's like, I think the PCA is great on doctrine. I think they do a good job on administering the sacraments purely, right? No one's doing Eucharistic benedictions in the PCA. I mean, there's problems you can point out, right? But like, if you're going to look at the abuse, it's like I think the PCA is doing it great, and they're doing discipline well. And then when I looked at the ACNA and the kind of doctrine being all over the place, Universalists and C4SO, to Anglo Catholics praying to saints. It's like I don't have a good reason enough to leave the PCA. That's what caused me to stay initially.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then as time went on, I think certain of my more like Puritanish views, I think, settle a little bit. Where just this makes no sense. Where if there was like a denomination that just like reform conformist, it'd be really tempting for me. That's just not the ACNA as given. So
Yeah.
that's where I ended up.
Yeah, I appreciate that because I think just the pragmatic kind of realization you had. I think that this is just something that happens with young guys in general. We've all had it where you really latch on to this ideal, and then the reality just doesn't match. And how do you kind of work that out? And there's all these different factors that have to come in. And I think that your story is kind of, I've always kind of just from afar kind of appreciated it, because like you could have come in hot, like you could have gone that way. But I think there's something unique about and helpful for other people to see, like you took some time to kind of, through guidance of wisdom, it's wisdom of other guys kind of telling you that. I think that there's a lot of good lessons to be learned in that. So then you had the pragmatic, but there's a little bit of ideological stuff too. So your views of episcopacy kind of allow you to be a Presbyterian without any problem. But then you said like the Covenanters, obviously that wasn't like your kind of cup of tea either.
No.
So tell me how the English Presbyterians kind of play a role for you to kind of give you some intellectual ease, or kind of give you like your Presbyterian version of Reformed Conformists. Where does this come into play in your like own intellectual journey after like the pragmatic portion?
So it's happened about 2 years ago now, where I know when I decided to stay in the PCA, I kind of feel like I killed myself. Like, my personality was very much, I was a Reformed Conformist guy. Like I was always quoting Davenant and Hooker and Usher and reading those guys, Perkins. And that's what I was kind of known for, which is kind of funny because I was never actually like truly an Anglican besides when I was working in the Episcopal Church. And so I was kind of a begrudged Presbyterian where, it is what it is, right? But then through some of the courses at Davenant, really through Dr. Michael Lynch, you're having to read guys like Baxter and Calamy, Williams, and then just kind of getting to read more about the origins of English Presbyterianism in some secondary literature and stuff. I started to have a different read on what was going on with the Westminster Assembly and the Presbyterians in England after that point. So usually, like if you hear Anglicans talk about English Presbyterianism, the first thing they do is go back to Cartwright, right? Yeah. And Elizabeth, and he's like a madman. He's kind of like insane. Like you have to have a Bible verse to drink a cup of water. You know what I mean?
No. Yeah.
But like the true English Presbyterianism, like a movement that kind of begins in the 1640s, really has very little like genealogical relationship to Cartwright. Really, what happened is when Laud passed the 1640 canons, a lot of the guys that were pretty happy conformists up to that point like lost their minds. Partly because they read the canons as teaching majority of episcopacy, partly because they felt like Laud was changing the rules of the game, whereas under the previous administration, under James, there was a lot more kind of toleration for stretching your conformity a little bit, right? Yeah. Where you could, okay, I'll put my surplice on when the bishop comes, and he knows that, but we're okay. Like, we have a relationship. I'll read the prayer book, but I'll throw in, maybe a few extra, extemporaneous prayers, or I'll skip a line there. And that wasn't uncommon under James, and they kind of were like, we can live with this. Yeah. And then when the Laudian regime comes in, and Law kind of enforces the law as it's written, and then I think adds kind of more, makes it a bit more concrete, they got uncomfortable. And so a lot of the guys at Westminster that kind of lead the English Presbyterian front, like Calamy, like Vines, like Stephen Marshall, I mean, they talk about Cranmer, they talk about Davenant, they talk about these guys as like they're the successors of that movement. Now, that's partly a rhetoric thing, obviously, but that's how they see themselves. They see themselves as continuing English Reformed divinity. Now, there's things that they differ on, right? They end up becoming really allergic to the form of government that the Church of England had at the time, preferring a more presbyterial form. And that kind of varies from figure to figure how extreme they were in their anti-episcopacy. So I'm getting rid of the details, kind of to zoom back out.
Well, what way did they appeal to you, I guess, on their that's helpful context. When you discover these guys at Davenant, what did they they see themselves as successors. But
Yeah.
what were some of the things about them that appealed to you and kind of gave you like,
Yeah.
okay, these can kind of be my guys as I enter into the
Yeah.
Presbyterian world?
That's good. Yeah, I think just getting to compare them with like the Scottish tradition is I think they're theologically a lot more in line with the older Reformed conformists, and I think they have a similar approach that I do when it comes to polity, which is that like, listen, the church is kind of free to organize how they need to, but they're principally very clerical, right, in their view of where church power comes from, right? It's vested in the ministers and it kind of trickles down from there. The presbytery is the fundamental, the church for them, and so there's a very high view of the ministry. But they're like, listen, if like we're going to do like true Scottish Presbyterianism, fine, right? But if we want to have a moderator we delegate certain authority to and have them do the ordinations, we can live with that.
Yeah.
And so that appealed to me. A lot of them, like, well, this kind of varies, but a guy like Baxter will say, listen, it's actually within the church's power to mandate forms, right? We're going to have a liturgical form. That's within the church's power. And a lot of them kind of recognize this, but their critiques of the imposed form really came down to like prudential grounds. Like, listen, it made sense to mandate this form back in, 1549 when half your clergy were like, couldn't remember the Lord's Prayer, and like, or like we're doctrinally not solid. It's why you have the Book of Homilies, these sorts of things. But now, that we kind of progressed on, I think we should have freedom. And there's certain ways you can tease out the argument that you may or may not disagree with. But they kind of recognize a lot of what I wanted to say about the church's innate power to organize itself. They recognize the ceiling of that I think I found helpful while trying to prudently apply it. And then I think theologically, they do present a more moderate form of Calvinism that I think is in line with a lot of the tradition, in line with the divines that were at Dort from England and Bremen and other places, which I thought was very attractive. And so, yeah, that's kind of initially what drew me to those guys.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think, just to have that, just find your people, that you can, the well that you can draw from in your own tradition, is crucial. You don't want someone to feel like they have to, be upset the whole time they're in a tradition. So that's really interesting. And so with those guys, is this where you encounter Baxter? Is that in this context where Baxter kind of was he amongst the English Presbyterians in that crowd that you were just mentioning, or was he kind of a little bit of a separate figure?
No, so he kind of represents the kind of a leader in that moderate Presbyterian movement in the second half of the 17th century. So he would have been alive and around. He was a chaplain during the Civil War, and he was friends with people at the assembly. So Gadiger he knew, Vines he knew. And so he kind of represents kind of the baton being handed off after the assembly.
Okay.
And by the time he dies, I mean, he was actually offered a bishop's hat during the Restoration. Then he turns it down. There's some quote, I forget, somebody says, it's like, he turned down, the hat of a diocese, but received the bishop's mitre of all of England, for his influence over in the Puritan movement. So he's a central figure. Yeah.
So this is where I kind of want to transition a little bit here.
Yeah.
So, I went to a Reformed seminary for a little bit, and I kind of came into the faith. I kind of came into Reform, Young Restless Reform movement. I was always kind of, I was told like Baxter is like, a papist. He's like, of mark and avoid. And I've only read like the Reformed Pastor, and that made me feel like a terrible person. It was just so intense. I was like,
be better.
Ministry. I mean, this guy's intense, but just I feel like when I was at the seminary I went to, like Bart was like, whoa, don't even like utter that man's name, or even Aquinas for that matter. It was just like there was just like this weird kind of dynamic here. So I count Baxter among kind of just what's been received in the world. So I'm just curious. You get into Baxter at Davenant. You have these intellectual guides who understand the sources and are obviously,
Mhm.
they're introducing you to him. What did you feel like? What were some misunderstandings maybe that, or what were some preconceptions you might have had of a figure of him as a figure that were kind
Yeah.
of um, clarified? Because I think that this is
Mhm.
just another dynamic where, in general, where there's just for some reason we inherited intellectual tradition where some people are castigated and it's just assumed. So I'm
Mhm.
curious what that moment was like for you, if you
Yeah.
had preconceived notions about him as a figure and what kind of misunderstandings were cleared.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I'll clarify too that I got into Baxter partly through Michael Blanchett Davenant, but also partly kind of organically through friendships and online Discord servers and reading similar things. And so, it's kind of like from both sides a little bit at the same time.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I was really skeptical initially. I was like, listen, all I've ever heard about this guy is that he's a moralist and doctrinally just wonky, and um, very close to Rome in his theology of salvation. Um, and so I was initially just very skeptical when I read him, and yeah, I was prepared to really not like what I was going to read. That's what I was prepared for. So I really came in averse.
Yeah.
Even though my friends were like, no, you gotta check this out. I'm like, no way, this is gonna be awful. Haven't y'all read anything about the Marrow controversy?
Like the nerdy way of like drug dealing or something. I don't know.
Right, exactly, exactly. It's exactly what it was. Yeah. So yeah, that was my initial expectation.
And what was kind of clarified for you, I guess, or when did you were like, oh, not as scary as I thought.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what hadn't come up yet in this conversation is partly a big change that happened undergrad was being introduced to Reformed scholasticism. Right, freshman year we had to read Intro to Reformed Scholasticism by Van Asselt, and so I was always kind of taught like those are the figures you want to look at is like the scholastic guys.
Yeah.
And so the first work I read from Baxter was On Imputation of Christ's Righteousness to Believers in What Sense. The title keeps on going after that.
Yeah.
And what I found was just, man, this is a beautifully written scholastic treatise that provides so much clarity on questions like I've never seen before. Like, and so I started just immediately fall in love with him because of his precision, just the way he writes, and the way he clearly states and asks the right questions when he's doing theology, which is like half the work of doing theology well, is knowing what questions to ask and knowing how to clarify things. And so it was reading that, and then reading that work too. In particular, you get a taste of Baxter's actual like soteriological system, and it was very clearly once you kind of understand what's going on, get past some of the verbiage. Oh, I see what he's trying to say here. This isn't that crazy, but you also understand why certain professors with blogs airdropping in from a quote they found somewhere else don't know what's going on. Because they haven't read the entire work and digested it, or they're reading him through another theologian's lens, and so that began to kind of crack my perception. And so at the time, I'd have been like, I may not use all of this language, right? But this is a very helpful theologian, worth the time of those that have the time to actually do the reading in him.
Sure. Yeah.
Probably not worth your time if you're not going to if you're only going to dip in a little bit, unless it's his practical works. Read all those. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I asked because I think if someone might not read Davenant, but I'm just curious about this this dynamic at play where I feel like Presbyterian circles in terms of retreatment is like maybe 30 or 50 years ahead of like where Anglicanism is, where it's just like
Right.
you can read Davenant in my circles and just have a blast, or you can read whoever you want, and it's just like it's like the Wild West. So what is it? What was that? What was the dynamic like? I guess for you, of kind of you're reading a guy and there's some clarification here, you find it helpful, but he's also like a lightning rod, and then there's a little bit of like buzz about it. If you're just quoting someone or taking a picture of a text you're reading, kind of thing. Like, what is that? What was that experience like, or experiencing that like?
Yeah.
Because you're in a different context now, where there is a more, I think, like robust secondary literature kind of that is almost orthodoxy for certain figures. If that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. So it's interesting. I think that's like a broader dynamic where for a long time, I'll just use Baxter as the example, but I think this applies larger.
This is a phenomenon, generally speaking.
For most of Reformed history, people didn't have access to all of like the Reformed tradition that's been written in English on your fingertips on your computer, right? So even 20 years ago, before this PRDL, before this Google Books, right, you just kind of had to go to a library somewhere, find a physical copy of X work, or just rely on secondary literature, right? And so Joe Schmo on his couch couldn't ever check the claim of Dr. Smith. I don't know Dr. Smith as an example. Writing about Richard Baxter, right? And so for a long time, also Richard Baxter's works just aren't being republished his theological works, right? You could find his practical works, but his theological works nobody had access to really, unless you're doing academic work and could somehow fly somewhere to look at those works. You probably find republished aphorisms or that sort of thing, but a lot of his works you didn't have access to. But now with the rise of the internet, right, and things like PRDL, Post-Reformation Dogmatics Library, I think that's what it is, and University of Michigan Library, right? You have like the entirety of like the Reformed tradition in English at your fingertips, basically.
Yeah.
And so that's destabilizing, right? You used to have kind of these authority structures you had to go to in order to access the information, but now everybody has access to the information.
Yeah.
And so you can read a scholar say X thing in a secondary literature about Baxter, and then you can go read 3 Baxter works and be like, I disagree with you,
right.
Which is an interesting, which causes an interesting problem because it kind of like historically shouldn't be that way, right? You shouldn't have to check the scholar, but like right now, right, like a 14-year-old has more access to Baxter than the average scholar did writing in like 1950, right? Uh-huh. Like that changes things. It changes the narrative about how you read things, and then that coupled with not just Baxter, but having access to so much more breadth of the Reformed tradition that we have in print. You have a different picture of what was tolerated, of what the Reformed tradition taught, rather than kind of this like streamlined view when all you're publishing is a certain handful of dogmatics, right? So like when all you have really is like your scholastic dogmatic is Turretin, right? And your Turretin says the Reformed say, the Orthodox say, right? You can have a certain view of what Reformed theology is. Now I like Turretin, but he's not, he's one guy amongst thousands, right? And we have access to those now. And so when you're able to read Baxter against the backdrop of the broader Reformed tradition, you quickly get a different view of where he fits in that tradition. Yeah. So that's just some thoughts. On
and
that.
So like with the democratization of information kind of here, how do you think that this can, other young guys are going to, go on, PR, the Puritan, post-Reformation dogmatics library, which I was introduced to in seminary, or somebody stumbles upon a work, some situation. How can this be done poorly, like the curiosity and discovery, in light of just broader dynamics, and how can it be done well, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a good question, because like there's a reason why you should typically trust the scholars doing the reading and writing. And that's because they have actual training in how to read early modern sources, right? They've had actual training how to do history, and they've hopefully, right, actually had some training in logic and some Aristotle, right? So when they're reading, they know what they're reading. Ideally, the second part, not a lot of people actually have. And so like doing the reading and doing it well involves discipline, right? And so you may remember this, like the peak of this would have been like, I don't know, 2020, 2021. You had like the Reformed Catholic TM bros on Twitter, and they just like spam, baptism saves. Here's like 10 quotes from like Reformed people saying baptism saves. And what was dangerous about that is you start to treat the Reformed tradition like a quote mine, right? Pulling things out of context. And you can quote 3 different figures saying baptism saves, But what do each of those mean, right? There's actually a variety within the Reformed tradition on the nature of baptismal efficacy, right? You can get really sloppy really, really quick using that tradition as kind of a quote mine to prove like your based Reformed Catholic takes. And so I think you just need to be able to be disciplined to read texts in their entirety, and to actually spend the time to learn the lingo, learn the language, spend some time, reading a logic textbook, spend some time trying to understand Aristotle. Otherwise, it's like, cool, you're reading stuff, but it's really obvious that you're not understanding what you're reading. And I think you've probably seen this, like, in certain Anglo-Catholic guys trying to read Cranmer.
Quote mine slopping everybody. It's like quote mine slop. Like, okay, you can find like a Caroline Divine who says this quote, and then you read that all back in. That's kind of what my conversation with Bishop Robinson was about. Like, it's just not being done with integrity. So I think that's helpful, for everybody to kind of, if you're going to just, don't read with an agenda. You kind of read, you're a little bit suspicious at first, and you kind of took the guy on his own terms, and it opened up realities for you. Where do you, I think this is something all of us have to ask, Gen Z guys going to ministry, like with this democratization of information. How do you think that changes, denominational dynamics, ecclesial dynamics, in the next coming generation kind of coming in? Like, it seems like this is going to happen probably left and right a little bit, with more information being accessible.
So it's very destabilizing, partly because now there's always been I think generational element in the PCA, for example, where different generations had different emphases. But now the vocabulary in the doctrine and kind of the shared assumptions have changed, right? And so just looking back at like 50 years of the PCA, right? People back then were reading Voss, right? People back then were reading Turretin. People back then were reading Hodge, right? And so even a lot of ministers now, like, those are kind of the things that they read, and there's these certain assumptions about what Reformed theology is, because it's kind of in a shared language, and kind of a shared curated, like, this is the library of Reformed theology, and then Bavinck came in and took the millennials by storm. But that's something that caused that much of a ruckus, right? Because at the end of the day, like, Bavinck's kind of within that world. Anyway, I'm going to avoid my Bavinck slander. Okay, so what happens is you have this whole generations going back of kind of shared assumptions about shared language, about what Reformed theology is, and now you have a group of young guys that are reading just entirely different things. You're gonna have young guys quoting guys like Davenant, or quoting guys like I'm just trying to think of a name. Random obscure Dutch dudes, right? Coxaeus or whatnot, which changes the game. And it doesn't just change the lingo amongst generation, even amongst Gen Z, right? You can have a Gen Z guy that's like deeply read in some obscure Dutch tradition, other guy that's reading English stuff, other guy that's been reading, right? And so there's no longer a shared language necessarily, and shared assumptions. And I think this comes out too doctrinally in a few respects. Like, one is the obvious one, is just like politics, right? You could, when I was at RTS Hybrid, right, this last week, I could like throw a dart. If I threw out like 5 darts, I'd hit one establishmentarian, I'd hit one Christian nationalist, right? And a lot of that is because, like, well, our tradition, we look at the old stuff on politics. That's not shared amongst the older crowd, right? If you talk about sacramental efficacy, right? A lot of guys are really into like saying cool, having a very high views about the sacraments in the PCA, which is just like a change. Ask about children, right, and how you treat them, right? It's going to sound a lot more. You're a lot more like, I'm discipling my kid because he's a believer from day one. Like, you're going to find that more often in the PCA.
I even think this conversation, the fact that you got a young Anglican and a young Presbyterian, like, there's more of an alignment, I think, affinity that we share, where I always was like, why is that, I don't get it. Like, there's like, you guys, like, prior generations, it was like, the these parachurch ministries where it's always like the Presbyterians and the Baptists together, and like you almost assume like the only difference they had was their view of baptism, and it seems like that is also kind of changing too.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. I think, well, because I also think Anglicans have done, I think, decent PR on the internet, like did a pretty good job of like putting themselves out there in the classical Protestant world. I think the existence of the David Institute helped with that. And so, yeah, I just think that shared assumption of like who are the closer allies. And I think a lot of people start seeing like, well, we should take paedobaptism seriously, we should take, the broader Reformed tradition seriously. And that kind of leads to a different view on that. I think that's part of it. But I don't want to be too monolithic. I don't want to overstate my case. I still think there's pockets where, the Reformed Baptist Presbyterian like alliance amongst some Gen Z people are still very strong. But I don't think it's as strong. And maybe another reason that this change has happened is like how much ecclesiology has come to the forefront, the forefront of conversation, right? Like in the 20th century, it's like why are John MacArthur, R.C. Sproul, James Boyce on the same stage? It's not because they like share a shared ecclesiology at all, right? No, it's because like they happen to have the same doctrine of salvation. I think
inerrancy, and all that.
Inerrancy, that too. But kind of after all those like battles have been won, the SBC is like been won. Calvinism is like very common to it's way more popular now than it's ever been. I think what Gen Z wants is good ecclesiology. They want a good outward form of the church. They want a discipline. They want a structure. Because the world they've inhabited feels so unmoored. And I think when you begin having the ecclesiology conversation, you actually start to say, no, we disagree about baptism. That's a big deal, right? Like you don't think my kids have a valid baptism. That's a big deal. I don't care if you're a Calvinist, right? And then so those that have a similar ecclesiology, you're more likely to have an affinity with because of your concern for, how you exist in the world as church, not just what you believe about certain things. So
I think that's I think the generational dynamics are interesting. I think there's a similar thing too where there's just a seriousness that's being Gen Z has in certain doctrines that just felt like they were adiaphora with prior generations. Obviously all hold to them on paper, but there is this disposition that is really interesting, and I think that destabilizing nature probably is a factor. And I do hope maybe older generations who are confused, maybe that can give some context. And it's just I find this in with guys who've stayed Anglican, just who view the Vatican II to now as a mistake completely that should be erased from all the history books of liturgical worship. Just an impatience for it, an intolerance for it. Unfortunately that's like poking a bear. Because if you grew up in tech after the liturgical movement, the 79 prayer book was your prayer book, and you're like poking on like an experiential kind of experience that's like kind of like a little bit personal. And it's like there's this massive disconnect, and sometimes it come off like, why are you being such a, I don't know how to say this appropriately, but why are you being so annoying about this kind of thing?
Right.
So how do you feel like with the fifth commandment of honoring those who've come before us, honoring those who've charted the way in many ways? What does it look like? How do you live that? How do we as younger guys entering these ecclesial spaces live that out? And I guess the flip side of that is, in what ways do you think maybe older generations are misunderstanding or exasperating the situation too?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think a big part of the controversy, if you will, or kind of the growing pains is a lot of the young guys take the fifth commandment very seriously, which is why they want to say, hey, the tradition says, right? Our Reformed fathers, our theologians have said this, and you fathers that are directly over us, you disagree with that, right? And so it's almost like we need to skip over the last generation or two or three or four in order to go back to our great-granddads and honor them. And that gives us license to treat our current leaders with contempt, right? And you'll notice that a lot, I think. I think this is a sin that we often have amongst our generation, just contempt. the boomers are in this. For me personally, I don't like the millennials. I love the Gen X though; they're great. That's a problem, right? And so I think you have to be able to put yourselves in like the shoes of the current older guys and what they read and the stuff they had access to, and don't like act all shocked when they haven't like read like like Wilbius or something. Like what do you mean you haven't read Wilbius or LeBlanc? You know what I mean? Like it's like, well, they have access to it, right? And so like don't
They're busy pastoring for decades. It's like they so it's
they did. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No,
You
expect them to have all this time to kind of read stuff, but they're in the thick of it, so that's another factor. Like respect the caring of souls that's going on. Well,
exactly.
Yeah, keep going.
No, you're right. No, yeah, exactly. I mean, and it's not like they've spent all their time like trying to branch out to new things, because like what are they doing week after week? They're reading a lot. They're reading commentaries. They're doing reading books about discipleship, and so just don't expect them to have participated in the same sort of like nerdy things you're doing at midnight. And I don't know, when I like discovered like the classical tradition, I kind of had this like deep resentment for a little bit to like my parents and everybody that came before me for like robbing me of like the tradition or whatever. That's just like such a silly attitude to have. You know what I mean? Like, this isn't something that they had access to. This is a gift you have now, and a gift that you should steward. And so I just think like the attitude needs to be like deep respect for your current elders, and pastors and parents, and find the stuff there that you think is like most helpful, and listen, and be willing to like respectfully disagree, but in such a way where it's not like, oh, you idiot old man, don't you know what I know? I think that's important.
Yeah, I think that point of how do we apply the fifth commandment is so apt. Like, we want to bring back the great tradition, but the most direct application of the fifth commandment is those who are more directly above you, who are alive right now. And I think I think I'm convicted by that too, because I think it's so easy to dismiss. How come you haven't read so and so? How come you really believe this? And their souls are being cared for, they're being watched, they're being stewarded, and that can't be lost. We can't lose sight of that. So I just appreciate that. And how do you think on the flip side of not exasperating your sons and daughters like generationally in terms of like this destabilization and this generational disconnect that can happen? What would you, from your own experience perhaps, or just general thoughts, in what ways there's like unnecessary contempt on the other way, from the other side?
I think what's going on does I think threaten certain views of the world that have kind of been understood to just be obvious, right? Like on the politics side of things, like on what constitutes the Reformed tradition side of things. And so it's easy to like look at the young guys and immediately just dismiss them of like, oh, you guys don't know what you're doing. You're just getting caught up in like things that are novel because you're young. But like we understand the world as it is. I think that's like one angle. But I don't know, if I was going to talk to my fathers in the faith, I'd just say like, hey, like try to put yourself in like our shoes and what we've been through in our generation, and understand that we're deeply skeptical of the world and the government and everything, because of like COVID and because of being told, we're the problem the moment we were born for being white and male. Like I think you have some sympathy for where we've ended up because of that. I also say on the flip side, like I would exhort my fathers to share in our love of the fifth commandment, and to be more disposed not to dismiss the tradition on those areas where they disagree with it. Not just to say, well, Calvin held his theology of the magistrate because he was a man of his times, and keep on going. You can't really dismiss like the arguments that the early moderns make when it comes to the state, or other questions, and then to view the increase in access to sources as a gift, and to be willing to be curious again about theology,
Yeah.
And to be patient, I think, with some of the foolishness of Gen Z, and as we try to do that.
Yeah.
But what I've found in my own experience as a Gen Z guy, talking to older men, is if you're willing to approach them in humility and not get triggered by some things, and just say, hey, hey, this source and explain a bit about the figure you're quoting. He says this, and this guy says this. So I think it might be more complicated than that. I think they are very, very likely, if you approach it humbly, as it's just you're asking questions and throwing things out there, you're likely to be treated well, and it's likely to be well received. That's not the case, I think, for certain academics, right?
Sure.
Because their jobs are on the line for how they read history. So if that view of history changes, that causes a challenge for them. So
yeah, and I think if I could add to that, I think sometimes what's lost is like we have young men who are zealously reading the sources. Like what? Like this is crazy. Like they could be bumming out playing video games, or like maybe they're in seminary and they're just trying to coast because it's like wow, like this is something unique and special. And I think the cry of our heart, that sounds a little bit, the desire, the hope that I would have is that would be that would be recognized and valued and appreciated. Like, oh, like there's a generation that really cares and like cares about really specific beautiful things, and that's better than apathy, and that's better than just coasting. And obviously, yes, Gen Z can be foolish and it's hard to deal with, and a lot of distrust, and I fall into that. But that would be what I would add to that. Like that's awesome. Like that should like some guys are reading the sources and going with it. So kind of with that zeal being stewarded, I just wanted to discuss you've been working on something that is not just you're not just reading and mining and learning this, learning about these different things, but you've actually kind of have done something that is going to be a gift, I hope, to the Presbyterian world at large. So why don't you tell us about this project you've got coming up soon with Davenant?
Yeah, thank you. So coming hopefully next November, October. It's been done for a while, but you know how publishing is. Will be a new edition of the Book of Common Worship. Now, that may sound like the TMU Book of Common Prayer, but the Book of Common Worship historically in Presbyterianism was the service book of the mainline Presbyterian Church in the United States. And actually, the PCUSA currently has like a new 2018 edition. But I think a similar story as Anglicanism, right? You have a good thing, the liturgical movement comes in and ruins it, right? And so in 1906, the PCUSA put out their first edition of the Book of Common Worship, went through a revision for the 1932 edition, and then they had 1946 edition, and it kind of had a new revision in the 90s, which wasn't that good. And so these are essentially Presbyterian service books. You'll have your service for morning and evening worship. You'll have for baptisms, Lord's Supper, family prayers, these sorts of things. Confirmation. That's what they called it in the book, which is interesting. Wow. And so what I kind of noticed in the Presbyterian world is there's a lot of interest in liturgy and kind of going back to traditional forms. But the common problem is that like Presbyterians assume we haven't like produced our own things. Yeah. And so either there's like self homebrew material, which varies on the talent of the pastor, right? Sure. I've seen some wild stuff out there. Or you basically have Presbyterians that'll pull from the worst parts of the Anglican tradition, right? So you'll find 1979 prayer book in being used to varying degrees in Presbyterianism. And so these kind of older liturgical forms kind of fell by the wayside, right? Like you don't find anybody talking about these. And so my goal was to take them and modernize them and kind of put them in a new edition that is kind of made for modern Presbyterianism. So I kind of taken these three editions, I've kind of recompiled them to like the best parts, kind of combined and put them together. And then modernize the language, and then with an eye towards modern Presbyterian directories for worship of like the PCA, ARP, EPC, and OPC. I kind of brought in conformity with that and modernize the language to kind of have a new available form of these great liturgical forms. for modern Presbyterianism. It also this edition will also have something like a daily office in there. There wasn't a daily office in the original one, but there was this service called a special service, which is kind of a lay-led service. And if you open it, you go, wait a second, this is just morning prayer from the prayer book. And so I just took that and just turned it back into morning evening prayer in the prayer book. And so there's some things about it that are distinctly, this is a Book of Common Worship thing in those services. And then you'll also find a lectionary in the back end. You'll have prayers to the Christian year and these sorts of things. So yeah, it's kind of the project. Yeah.
Well, that's exciting. So November, Lord willing, it'll be out.
November, Lord willing. So we're still working on solidifying the title. We might be opting for Common Worship, a Presbyterian service book. Drop the book off. It's cleaner that way, But we'll see what the publisher ends up deciding.
And are these like meant for the pews, or the?
Yeah, that's a great question.
I'm curious about what's its design going to be for.
Yeah, so they were always designed for the pews. The original 1906, 31, 46 editions were designed for the pews. It's unclear how often that was actually done, right? Presbyterians typically haven't worshipped out of books. They've usually used bulletins, right? And so this is designed for the pew, right? You could put it in a pew, you could open it up, you could go through a service. But I imagine it'll probably be used more as a resource book.
Okay.
But what's great about it too is like you can do this in a pew, but also just for home, for family worship. There's all these family prayers in the back. You have the daily office. You have a shorter catechism in the back too, for catechizing. And so, it's more than just for like the divine service. You can find use for it. But I'd love to find a church that ends up putting it in the pew. That'd be great. It'll be a beautiful volume. And Davidin just recently switched their printer, and it's even better now. So
very good. Well, I'm excited for all the stuff that Davidin's doing. It just seems like there's just some amazing stuff coming out. So I'm excited for you and for Davidin and for this project. And if there's any Presbyterians who are listening, keep your eye out for that. And I think, no matter, as an Anglican, I'm still, I'm rooting for the PCA and seeing some, liturgical kind of conformity there, and bringing this into that arena. I hope it it grows and grows in popularity, and people use it. So that's really exciting. Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on. I think this was a great conversation, just to kind of sit and kind of reflect a little bit on like what these like generational dynamics are, what your own journey and how you process it. I really appreciate you just sharing that. And I hope that it really, it can guide some younger guys too, who are exploring theology and encountering, these sources. And it just feels like a lot of different information at once. And I know we're not that old yet, but, there's lessons that we've learned in that process. So thank you so much for coming on. I really do appreciate it.